I want to thank the session conveners for the invitation, and I welcome you all to a presentation on the impacts of permafrost thaw on the biogeochemistry of boreal peatlands, accounting for all ecosystem transitions. I want to acknowledge that this has been a large group effort, and I'll be showing results from a number of studies with the lead authors acknowledged here on this page. The region of interest where the studies have been conducted is that of boreal Western Canada. It is the third largest peatland region in the Northern Hemisphere after the West Siberian lowlands and the Hudson Bay lowlands. It's of interest partly here from our point of view because it sits at the southern edge of permafrost. Most of it, this region, is discontinuous permafrost. It's also a region that has been warming very fast over the last couple of decades. And it's also a region with an active and an intensifying wildfire regime. Here's an example by a satellite image of what a peatland in this region can look like. And one of the things I want to highlight here is the fine-scale mosaic of distinct land cover types within these peatlands. The land cover types, or the landform types of interest here, includes the peat plateau. This is the only landform in the peatland that has a permafrost core that elevates it above its surroundings, so it becomes a quite dry peatland ecosystem, the water table often at the base of the active layer, lichen, shrubs, stunted black spruce trees. The next landform we have are the thermokarst bogs. These are non-permafrost, often found sort of surrounded by the peat plateaus. The peat plateaus are sort of shielding the bog from connection to regional groundwater flows. So it remains ombrotrophic, nutrient poor, low pH, dominated by sphagnum mosses, some shrubs, wet, but usually not inundated. Many of these thermokarst bogs are completely surrounded by peat plateaus, and therefore they do not generate any runoff. That instead goes to our channel fence. So any runoff that moves into these becomes part of the catchment drainage network. They vary in nutrient regime for anything from really poor fens to extreme rich fens, depending on which region and what position in the landscape we are. But I do tend to find that these channel fens are generally wetter than fens south of the permafrost border, possibly because the water is really confined by the peat plateaus that are surrounding it. Lastly, this landscape has numerous shallow peatland ponds. So the ecosystem transition that were hinted at in the title of the presentation, these are the ones that we'll be considering. So the peat plateau thawing and collapsing into a thermokarst bog, into the more nutrient-rich sedge-dominated channel fens, or as expansion of our thermokarst ponds. So the first transition we have is that of plateau to bog. And we've had a number of studies done where we're asking, what is the carbon storage following thaw? What's the future fate of the carbon or the peat that's thawing out? So Christian here collected cores from the plateau, the recently thawed, and the sort of 200 years since thaw bogs, and incubated them. Again, it's a 5-6 meter deep, and we've incubated and down to 10,000 years old. And the decay rate constant for a 2-year anoxic incubation shows that we have a common trend with decreasing lability with age and depth. Really what we were looking for here was if we had any evidence of highly labile peat being thawed out. So if the peat plateau, the light blue PP, had higher lability for the same age and peat type than in the young bog, mature bog. And that is not the case. We're not finding evidence here of a pool that is highly labile and ready to be decomposed post-thaw. The next study here, Liam looked at the microbial community for the same transect. And one of the reasons for doing this is that we also know that the environmental conditions differ here. The young bog compared to the mature bog, the young bog is wetter, which means that it's a lot warmer, actually, even down to 1 meter or 2, like 2-3 degrees warmer. It also has a different vegetation. You can see the moss composition is different, and there's more sedges with roots that go deep down. And if we look at the microbial community in an NMDS space, we see that near the surface, the plateau and the young and the mature bog are quite different. But then as you go down core, we start seeing a convergence of the young bog and mature bog, but there are distinct differences that do remain. The young bog microbial community, below 1 meter and down to 1.5 meters, still looks like the microbial community at 20, 30 centimeters depth of the mature bog. So what are the implications for carbon cycling? So Liam also looked at the total carbon storage here, and we've dated the transition of the peats. We know how long ago did the site thaw. And when we do a trend line here, what we're finding though is that while it trends towards a lower carbon storage with age, it is not significantly different from zero. So we can't say anything other than this is largely a neutral carbon balance post-thaw. Partly we think this is why. This is probably partly because the peatlands in this region, they are old, about 10,000 years, and they didn't really grade permafrost until about 2,000 years ago. So most of the peat in these ecosystems has persisted under non-frozen anaerobic conditions for many hundreds or thousands of years. But total carbon storage is not the only. We also have the trace gases, and we're going to look at nitrous oxide and methane. Here, Chris has looked at nitrous oxide, and he's finding that the transition to a bog actually leads to the uptake of nitrous oxides. Chris, however, we also had a hypothesis. We were looking or testing to see whether we had high nitrous oxide emissions following fires. We thought with the lack of primary production and the release of nutrients, that sort of favorable moisture conditions for denitrification, that it was possible to have nitrous oxide emissions following fire, but our flux measurements cannot support that. We do not find a pulse following fire. For methane, we are now comparing here. This is Lorna's work, comparing the methane emissions between the plateau, the thermokarst bogs, and the channel fens. The plateaus having methane uptake being dry, and then moderate emissions from the bog, nutrient poor, usually a bit more higher emissions from these moat young bog stages, and then the fens that are interesting, and where we're finding that we usually have the highest methane emissions, but they're also the most variable. And that goes along with the high variability in water chemistry we have here. And for example, an interesting study site here was this Lutos Fen 2 that we had, which had our lowest methane emissions that we observed. And this site was our most nutrient rich and highest salt concentration. So a possibility here is that some of these fens actually receive so much sulfur that a sulfide inhibition of methanogenesis. The ponds are also large methane sources. Here, Kenzie's looked at Eli Lake at one of our sites, and she looked at the spatial variability within the pond. And she found that the emissions were dominated by ebullition, and that those along the thawing edge, where the peat plateau is collapsing, were much higher than those on a stable edge on the other side. Another key difference here was that the ebullition age, the radiocarbon age from the thawing edge was much older than that of the stable edge. However, these edges, it's not orders and orders of magnitude in difference. And when you do an upscaling for the lake emissions, yes, the thaw edge matters, but it's not a huge influence on the total pond methane emissions. One thing that Kenzie have found, though, is that once we looked at lakes at a large regional scale, so this is sort of 1,000 miles apart, and she studied 20 lakes, 5 at each of these locations here, and if we did methane emissions, we found that methane emissions from peatland ponds south of the permafrost border was about 8 times greater than those within the continuous permafrost zone. That's a very high sensitivity, and as a Q10, it's greater than what would be expected. And we are finding evidence from microbial community composition and water chemistry, so tying into the productivity of the lake perhaps as well, that helps bolster the methane emissions as we're losing permafrost. Thinking about catchments with peatlands and how the chemistry of the stream water can act as a sentinel of change. So we have a number of studies here where we've looked at water chemistry from different aspects, where we do space for time. We're sampling across a large region, across the permafrost transect, trying to understand what the continued permafrost thaw can mean. So Renee sampled 80 streams this summer across this region. And in this graph, you have the wetland or peatland cover of the catchment. And on the y-axis is the concentration or the color of the water. And yeah, we find that there is a strong interaction between watershed peatland cover and its climate. So the red ones here are non-permafrost catchments in the southern part, and they at an equivalent water peatland cover, they have much higher DOC concentrations. So if we're expecting increasing DOC concentration with permafrost thaw, what are the implications of this? So Andrew looked at one stream here in the discontinuous permafrost zone, where we looked at whether the terrestrial-derived peatland DOC is fueling the lotic food webs, amphipods, insects, and fish. Using isotopic mixing models, we find, however, that the vast majority of the biomass of our food webs in these streams is from primary production, algal production within the streams, not derived from the DOC. Another aspect that's tied to the DOC is that of methylmercury. So Lauren here, she sampled streams even more broadly than Renee, so from the continuous permafrost zone down to well south of the permafrost boundary. And interesting here, her sampling did not find permafrost extent to be a main driver. However, what Lauren does find is that there's a very strong link between the dissolved organic carbon concentration and the methylation percentage here, which is a measure of production of methylmercury in these watersheds. Lauren has also looked at the concentrations and methylation potential of methylmercury in bogs and fens. And we are finding that with increasing nutrients and ion concentrations in the pore water of the bogs and fens, we're finding higher concentrations of methylmercury. So this might become one of the mechanisms of, well, both increased DOC concentration and with that, the movement of methylmercury downstream. So to summarize, I think it's fair to say that if you want to understand the landscape carbon storage, greenhouse gas balance, or downstream water quality, it's important to understand the biogeochemistry of each of these transitions. So the transformation of the peat plateaus into ponds, fens, and bogs. We're working on ways of doing upscaling and trying to put the pieces together for a landscape carbon balance and greenhouse gas balance, for example. There's a next step to consider here, and that's the more longer term, as this landscape is losing the last bits of permafrost, allowing the water movement across the full landscape and the maturation of these ecosystems. So sort of the secondary step here, which is the one which I envision is going to transform this peatland landscape to the ones that we see currently south of this region, right? But what are the timescales for this? Like, how important are the intermediate stages and what's the end point? Those are interesting questions to keep working at. And thank you all for listening. I want to make sure that we acknowledge here that the land where our research has been conducted is located on Treaty 8 and Treaty 11 Canadian territories, which is the home of the Dene, the Gwich'in, Klitschko, Satu Cree as well as the Métis. And we recognize this land as an act of reconciliation, and we're grateful to those whose territory we're visiting. Thank you.